Welcome to the Natural Capital Initiative's talk and Q&A. How can humanity sustainably engage with nature? The Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity. We are pleased to have ecologist Ruth Waters here with us today. She's from the Dasgupta review team, which was hosted by the UK Treasury. And Ruth will summarize the main messages from the review and also answer your questions on its implications, particularly to the research and policy communities. We have a large and informed audience today, so we look forward to hearing your questions and getting a better understanding of what those key questions in your mind are and what messages to take forward from this work. After a short talk, Dr. Laura Bellingham from the Royal Society of Biology will conduct a Q&A with Ruth, and Ruth will be joined by her teammate, Rebecca Knoll from the Dasgupta review team. So please share your questions using the Q&A function, and also please share any comments you have in the separate chat. And all of this is, of course, very invaluable information for us to take forward. But now I would like to hand over to Ruth to hear more about this very interesting, important, exciting piece of work.
Thanks very much, Minna. So there's just a few minutes while Minna and I fiddle about with our screens. I'm just going to share my slides with you. Hopefully, can you see that? Everybody, Minna, could you reply?
Excellent, yes, thank you.
Yes, marvellous, thank you very much. Okay, well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here today, actually, and tell you about the Dasgupta review, because I think many of you have been on a journey with us. Lots of you really helpfully contributed to the call for evidence. You've commented on the interim review, and we did a presentation on that. And also you took part in the spring workshops that Minna mentioned that the NCI hosted for us to help us with some of the content, which was brilliant. And I'm really excited about this review. The review is essentially calling for a fundamental change in the way we undertake mainstream economics. And it provides the theory as to why this is essential and a blue point for doing this. And importantly, it's grounded in really good ecology and earth sciences, and explicitly sets nature and biodiversity as the core of this framework. So we all know that biodiversity is in a terrible state. Biodiversity loss is at an unprecedented level. 75% of land and 66% of the oceans has been degraded by humans. And these reports are coming thick and fast, and society is waking up to this problem. But economics and finance decision makers are actually well placed to accelerate action for biodiversity loss and transformative change for our inclusive wealth. So in 2019, the Treasury commissioned this independent global review to look at the economics of biodiversity, led by the lead reviewer, who is Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta from Cambridge University. And what the review does is it explores the sustainability of humanity's engagement with nature and provides this comprehensive framework for thinking about how we apply economics in decision making that will enhance biodiversity and economic prosperity for now and in the future, with this deep understanding of ecosystem processes at its heart. So I just wanted to explain a little bit about where biodiversity itself fits into this framework. So within the review, ecosystems are the ecological units, are the kind of foundational units which we look at. And of course, these are dynamic systems that interact with each other and collectively make up the global biosphere within which we live. And biodiversity within these ecosystems enables them to be both productive and resilient, being able to respond to change, environmental change. And ecosystems work best when they have these full complements of biodiversity. And biodiversity also enables a whole range of ecosystem functions and processes. And one of the critical things about these is many of these are actually irreplaceable, and we can't simply substitute them with technology. So really important. So this ecosystem functioning enables the productivity and resilience, which in turn enables this flow of ecosystem goods and services on which we rely for producer capital, human capital, and the economy. So at its heart, the review says that biodiversity loss is an asset management problem. It views nature as an asset, which provides us with a flow of goods and services over time. And rather like in financial portfolios, diversification can reduce risks and uncertainty in returns. So biodiversity in our asset portfolio, in our natural asset portfolio, reduces the risks and uncertainties around flows of goods and services for us. But what that means, in a sense, is that we are all, in effect, asset managers, whether we're individuals, businesses, or governments. And all our decisions that we're making on spending and investment are impacting on the mix of natural, human, and produced capital, whether we're doing it consciously or unconsciously. But unfortunately, we have failed really to manage our global portfolio of assets. And this chart from UNEP shows global per capita accounting values for 3 capital goods since the early 90s. And what we can see is that produced capital has pretty much doubled since that time. Human capital has increased by 13%, but natural capital has decreased by 40%. So we're really running down our stocks of natural capital while we're accumulating human and produced capital. So in a way, humanity has prospered, but that's come at the expense of nature. So we can see in this chart that since 1950, the global economic output has increased by 15-fold. Our population, global population, has tripled, and our life expectancy has doubled. But on the other side of this seems to have come at nature's expense. So this graph actually shows the Living Planet Index, which is species population abundance of certain groups of species. And we can see that these have declined by 68% since 1970. And also we know that species extinction rates are high, 100 to 1,000 times higher than baseline rates. And the IPBES global review showed that 14 out of the 18 ecosystem services that they looked at have declined. And of course, global temperatures are going up and we're breaching several of current planetary boundaries. So in the review, what we say is that demands far exceed nature's capacity to supply us with these goods and services on which we rely. And the review describes this in an equation or in a perspective called the impact inequality. And on one side of this, you've got nature's supply, which is essentially the stock of the biosphere and its ability to renew and regenerate. But on the other side, we've got the demand of the demands on the biosphere, which is made up of the number of people and their economic capital per head, but also the efficiency within which we draw down goods and services from the natural environment and the extent to which we transform the natural environment from the waste and pollution that we put back in. And the review asserts that for several decades, the impact equation has consistently been an inequality, where our aggregate demands are far outstripping nature's supply. But it's not only just the aggregate demands, I'll put my teeth back in a minute, that are the problem. We also know that distribution plays a big role in this. So humanity's demands on nature's and nature's supply varies significantly across countries. Demand has outstripped supply to a greater extent for some ecosystems and geographies more than others. And this has had ongoing impacts on the distribution of our natural assets and the flow of ecosystem goods and services. And at the moment, high-income countries currently account for a disproportionate large amount of humanity's demands. And on the supply side, natural capital forms a larger part of the wealth of developing countries who typically have richer biodiversity stocks. So also within the review, we look at the role of equity across different populations and different people groups, and also things like social and environmental justice and the way that distribution is so important in relation to our natural capital stocks. But ultimately, biodiversity loss is leading us to increasing declines in our ecosystem resilience, their productivity, and presents really mounting risks to our welfare and prosperity and economies. And there are 2 key reasons why we need to address these issues really urgently. And the first one is around tipping points. So tipping points are where ecosystems shift from biodiverse, stable states to less biodiverse, less productive states, often caused by degradation or fragmentation or loss of species. And these tipping points can be quite difficult to predict. They can have far-reaching impacts as well. So, for example, it's predicted that if the Amazon rainforest moves from the current state across a tipping point to become savanna, that will impact on the world's water cycle, having huge far-reaching effects for us across the globe. And the other really important point about these tipping points and regime shifts is they're extremely difficult to reverse. In some cases, we have managed to reverse them, but in many cases, they're actually irreversible. They are, in effect, points of no return. And these obviously create huge problems of risk and uncertainty for ourselves as society, but also for our economy. But the second reason why we need to act really, really urgently is that nature, in effect, offers us a whole range of solutions for both current and future challenges. For example, around 70% of cancer drugs that we currently use are natural or have been inspired by nature. And of course, extinction is irreversible. It's not only a tragedy for biology, but it also means a loss of these potential benefits that we could use. So conservation is definitely important to help keep our options open. And these options mean that nature has high option value for us. So if we look at this in the round, we have the risks around tipping points and regime shifts, and then we have the opportunities around maintaining our option value of nature. So it's much better to conserve rather than restore once things have degraded. It's much better to act now rather than later to avoid these risks and uncertainties. And a study by Vivid Economics and the Natural History Museum looked at what the costs would be for action to maintain current levels of biodiversity at the current state based on biodiversity intactness index compared to what would happen if we had to delay by 10 years. And what they found was that the social value or the incentives required to undertake actions to maintain the current level of biodiversity, if we delay by just 10 years, will double in costs. And also, it looks like a lot of the actions required are so large that it would almost be unfeasible to do. So really significant reason for acting urgently. But at the heart of the problem, the review identifies deep-rooted, widespread institutional failure. And I think institutions are the rules and arrangements that govern these collective undertakings. And they can take place in anything from our own households through to markets or states or transnational organisations. But there are key three features of nature that we've identified: that it's mobile, moves around, it's often silent and invisible like soil biodiversity, which has made it very difficult for institutions to comprehensively record its use of and impacts on nature. And this has given rise to pervasive, detrimental externalities in the way we use our biodiversity. Putting it simple, nature is simply not being accounted for in these institutions. And it's also, as we know, open to no monetary charge. We don't incorporate the full price, the full accounting price, the full range of values within our market prices. And there's many more values we derive for nature that are not taken account of. And these pricing distortions have meant that we've invested far more in things like produce capital and underinvested in things like our natural assets and our natural capital. And not only that, but many of our institutions have proved unfit to manage these externalities. And evidence suggests that there's governments almost everywhere have made this worse by encouraging people to exploit rather than protect nature. And we also think we lack institutions in some areas, such as dealing with things like global public goods, like the global oceans or rainforests. But the review does look into values and recognises sort of 6 sources of biodiversity value. And it also explores issues of the moral standing of nature and personhood. And it looks at methods for estimating these accounting values, but recognises we're still some way from actually incorporating all these forms of values into our decision making. But Partha is very clear that we shouldn't let perfection be the enemy of good. And it's much better to work with the figures that we have now whilst trying to improve them, rather than to ignore a whole swathe of capital goods, pretending they simply don't exist. But another key reason for our unsustainable engagement with nature has been our failure on how we've applied economics. Simply speaking, our economies are embedded with nature, within nature, and not external to it. And even the models that economists often use that recognise nature is finite still assume that in some way we can break free of nature through technological advances. But the ecology and our understanding of ecosystem and natural processes shows that that simply isn't true, and that we need to accept that ourselves as humanity and the economy is embedded within nature. And this forces us to recognise the limits or the boundedness that nature places on our economies. So to engage sustainably with nature, the review identifies three broad buckets of transformative actions that need to take place. The first is around balancing our impact equation and increasing nature's supply. The second is around changing our measures of success. And the third is around transforming our institutions and systems. And I'm just going to talk you through some of these things in a little bit more detail. So in this landscape, we can see 12 of our options for change, which are in these three broad buckets I just described earlier. So if we look first at balancing our impact equation and increasing nature's supply, I'm going to go around in a clockwise direction. So first of all, we need to conserve and restore our natural assets, both in terms of quantity and, importantly, quality as well. Review seeks for us to improve the efficiency from which we extract from nature and produce a lot less waste. It's seeking fair and sustainable consumption, production and supply chains. It's looking for this better integration of management of land and sea for people and nature, multifunctional lands and seascapes, and also improved access to community-based family planning and reproductive health. So if we have a look at the second bucket of measures, these were around changing our measures of economic success. And one of the key recommendations within the review is for us to adopt an inclusive wealth approach as our measure of success. And I'll drill down a little bit more into this in a minute. Alongside that, we need to improve our productivity measures by ensuring they account for nature and improve decision making through natural capital accounting, making that much more widespread. And in our third bucket of transformations, we're looking for these changes and improvements in institutions and systems. So in the first one, on the left-hand side, we're looking to empower citizens to make informed choices and implement change. And the review does look at community and civil society engagement in quite a bit of detail. And it also looks at effective institutions at all levels as part of that civil society and community engagement. It particularly focuses in on polycentric approaches to institutional arrangements as successful. It also focused strongly in on the global financial system that supports nature and the reforming of education and economics to actually reflect properly the role of nature and the fact that humanity and the economy is embedded within it. So I'm going to zoom in again, into each of these, some of these areas for you to give a bit more description. So particularly on increasing nature's supply. As I said to you, the review asserts that we need to improve the quantity and quality of our stocks of natural assets, and these need to increase significantly. And it goes through a whole range of different potential things that we can do about this, and I've picked out a number for you here. It has quite a strong focus on well-managed protected areas with sufficient human and financial resources, institutional support and community engagement. And at the moment, we only know that about 20% of our protected areas are being well managed, even though we know they can be extremely successful at protecting nature, biodiversity, providing ecosystem services and reducing poverty. So there's quite a bit we can do in that space. It looks for improvements in the regulation and enforcement of wildlife conservation and wildlife trade, and things like issues of zoonosis emergence from species exploitation is looked at in more detail. There's clearly a big topic at the moment. It seeks for us to scale up measures to address both the stewardship of land and sea for nature and people, and looks at things like agri-environment schemes as a way to do that. And it seeks better spatial planning at all levels, building in natural capital, making provision for nature in our planning and seeking net gain from our losses. And it's also looking for significant scaling up and significant increase in investment in nature-based solutions to provide solutions for climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and space for biodiversity in nature and other ecosystem services. So if we have a look at sustainable consumption and production and supply chains in a bit more detail, we know that consumption in high-income countries is projected to remain the key factor in driving the world's ecological footprint even larger. But estimates suggest that we can provide enough food for our present population with just 50% of current agricultural land if we move to more of a plant-based diet. So shifting to less ecologically damaging consumption and production patterns is a really key part of this. We can also need to significantly reduce what we return to the biosphere as waste and pollution, and reduce overproduction. So the FAO suggests that around a third of food is actually wasted in supply chains or in households. And we need to diversify production systems and enable them to be sustainable. So things like agroforestry and low trophic agriculture can provide us with food and also support nature and ecosystems. And clearly technology has a role here in making us more efficient in what we use from nature and what we put back. And things like precision farming can really help us here. And I think supply chains, embedding in transparency into our complex supply chains would make a really big difference. If we have high quality information available, good practice can be verified at every stage, and actors along the supply chain can be really held to account. And one of the things we do explore in more detail is around the role of socially embedded preferences, which can help us lower consumption patterns of ecological harmful commodities and other behaviours and reduce our input on the biosphere without actually harming our well-being. So if I zoom in a bit on the second bucket of things, which is about improving our measures of success, we just have a look at inclusive wealth and natural capital and counting. Inclusive wealth is in fact the sum of accounting values of produced human and natural capital. And if it's done well, it can be really great because it actually mirrors the changes in intergenerational welfare and could tell us a lot about that. But while standard economic measures such as GDP are indispensable in short-run macroeconomic analysis, they're not very good and mislead us when we're looking at long-term social well-being across generations, which is why we think inclusive wealth is an important way to develop. And of course, natural capital accounting is key to some of this in terms of understanding better our natural capital within this inclusive wealth framework. And we can do much more to help build capacity and enable there to be more data available for us to do accounting much more widely. So on the institutional bucket of change that we were looking at, I've zoomed in a bit on finance for you and the finance system. And there's two key areas around finance that we looked at. One is around changing financial flows. So we think that the global financial system can play a really important role in determining demand and supply on nature. And at the moment, global financial investments are actually relatively small. They're around $78 to $143 billion a year. But this compares to flows devoted to harmful activities, which are much larger. And we calculated that the social costs of perverse subsidies that damage nature are around 4 to 6 trillion per year. And the way we can kind of change these flows are being three categories of actions. The first is around increasing financial investments to enhance natural assets and their sustainable use. The second is around reforming some of the money we already spend to combat environmental issues, to things that can deliver multiple benefits. So can we use, for example, some climate change money which could deliver on both climate change adaptation and mitigation and biodiversity at the same time through things like nature-based solutions. And the third key point is around reducing these harmful financial investments and encouraging them to be redirected to sustainable use. So the second part of institutional improvements that we can make in the finance area is around managing risk and uncertainty. And the review really highlights the importance of disclosures and monitoring and management of nature-related financial risk. And we think there are quite a wide range of nature-related financial risks for this sector, which have really big implications. So apart from climate change risk, the management of these risks is not really taken into account. And more global support is needed for initiatives directed at enhancing the understanding and awareness among financial actors of these risks, learning and building on advances from the climate-related financial risks. So things like there are initiatives like the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, which are really important to continue to develop and to scale up. And so I think just briefly on this slide, we can see that actually for the financial sector, as ecosystems and our natural assets become more degraded, the risks to investment and the costs of restoration increase. So it makes really good financial sense to keep things on the left-hand side of this graph. So in summary, overall, we found that we are seriously mismanaging our most precious asset, which is nature, and our demands are far exceeding its capacity to supply. And there's a whole bunch of risks around why this is really becoming more and more problematic. And the economic and finance decision making needs to reflect that humanity is embedded within nature. And we need to massively reduce our demands on nature and increase nature's supply. And economic measures of success need to be improved. Inclusive wealth is the appropriate main measure of sustainable economic prosperity. And effective institutions and systems are required to enable our sustainable engagement with nature to help fix the problems of widespread institutional failure and pervasive externalities. So thanks very much. That was a really massive trot through, very quick trot through what is over 600 pages of the full review. But I'm really looking forward to your questions. But also, just so that you know, there is 3 different sort of versions, if you like. There's a full large version of the review that you can read at your leisure. There's an interim sized one, which is shorter, which has all the key points, but not quite so long. And then we have a list of high-level messages as well. So, you know, if you haven't done so, there are options to engage with some of this, you know, at all levels. So thanks very much. Back to you guys in the studio.
That's back to me in the studio, I think, Ruth, and thank you very much for that overview, which was really great, and I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. And also delighted to welcome in Rebecca Knoll, who's a natural scientist, also working on the review. And both of you can now be peppered with questions because there are many appearing in the Q&A and covering lots of really chunky topics and taking lots of inspiration from what you told us. So just to introduce myself, which I forgot to do, I'm Laura Bellingham. Work with the Natural Capital Initiative on behalf of the Royal Society of Biology. So I particularly love the natural science aspects, but we won't allow that to influence the Q&A. I just particularly want to start with, in no particular order, with the questions, but one that's come through, and it's been something that's been raised with us in advance of the meeting as well, is that this is an excellent review. And this question is coming from Peter Young in particular, to thinking about the links to the Stern Review, which was also a very pivotal and welcomed at the time report, but has taken a long time to come into mainstream. It's getting a lot of attention even now, but that is, that's a 2006 review. So Peter Young comments that it was loudly endorsed by the government of the day and a Climate Change Act followed. What could we do and with whom to get a similar or greater, and I suppose I would like to add quicker, attention to acting on the recommendations? And while it seems that even the current Environment Bill is struggling. So over to you.
Thanks. I think that's a really great question. So, I mean, first of all, now the review's out, what the government will do, will do a response to the review So that's been led by other colleagues in Treasury, but we'll have input from DEFRA and across government. So, you know, that's one place where the government will seek to comment and possibly commit to things that we've suggested in the review. That's all to be determined. I think the other thing that's really brilliant is this morning I was fortunate enough to be on a call with some of the people discussing the G7 and the environment work stream of the G7. So we've got a whole range of really high-level meetings this year. One, the G7, which we have the presidency of. We've also, of course, got the climate change COPs and the biodiversity COPs. And this review is feeding in to all of the discussions around work and commitments within those three key sort of international fora. So I think across that, you know, there are opportunities for us to embed some of the findings of the review probably more rapidly than, you know, if they'd all been spread out on different years. And certainly, I think Rebecca and I think, have both been delighted in how the review's been, well, the whole team's been delighted with, you know, how the review has generally been received. So I think there are signs for optimism for this to be, you know, mainstreamed quite quickly, hopefully. But of course, some things will take time. But you know, some of the things, you know, could really get into international discussions early on this year, which would be great.
Rebecca, I'm just giving you a chance if you've got any quick recommendations for how to get this in faster, or things that people could be doing to help.
I think I would really echo what Ruth just said there about the opportunities this year with COP15 and COP26 coming up, and also the opportunity for the UK in particular as G7 president and also host of COP26. And I think in a lot of places we can really build on the traction which the climate agenda has already had. I mean, we emphasize some of that in the finance messages, but I think it can come across in other aspects too.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Now, so perhaps a more broad-ranging question, picking up on a point from Paul Logan, was what should we be measuring that we don't now? You know, what were there sort of particular things that really struck you in the course of putting this together that you wondered these are areas that we should be measuring, or areas we should be thinking about that we just don't?
Great question. I'm a bit of a data, I don't know. So quite early on, I mean, this is a personal reflection. Quite early on, you know, one of the questions I wanted to ask was, what stock do we have now? So this was a global review, guys. So although, you know, it was kicked off in the UK, it was a global review. And it was surprisingly difficult to even go out there and find, you know, some data on, you know, what is all the stock of the natural assets we've got? What are the ecosystems we've got? What size are they? What state are they in? What quality are they? And, you know, this kind of cascaded into an experience in the review that, you know, we do have enough to act, we have enough to inform, but, you know, in many cases of all sorts of data we looked at, there wasn't kind of regularly collected, systematically collected data that you could measure change over time, you know, in very easily. So, you know, I think if you look at the natural capital accounting, often the accounts are restricted by the data that's available, so they're not as broad as they could be if there was more data on different sort of some of the different themes. But even, you know, some of the ecological data is not it's not at the scale or not regularly connected enough for us to see change very easily. I don't know, I'm going to pass over to Rebecca on some of the stuff that she studied as well. But
yeah, thanks, Ruth. And I would just also echo what you said in the slide about inclusive wealth, about the proportion of countries which do actually regularly report on their natural capital accounts, and that you know, it's only 43 who've published them since 2008, so there's clearly a very long way to go in terms of collection and reporting. And also that hardly any countries actually fund ecosystem extent accounts. So even when there is some form of natural capital accounting in place, it's often not really representing a lot of detail about a country's ecosystem extents or ecosystem quality. And also, I'm glad that Ruth mentioned the real struggle to find out find really quality data on our stock of natural capital and biodiversity globally, because I just remember all those conversations that we had at the time when you were researching that, and it really, really was difficult to come across really good quality data there, despite all the work which has gone on, you know, at local levels.
Great. I'm going to riff off a couple of questions that have come in, thinking about whether or not some of the problems with getting activity into practice in terms of preserving biodiversity is because of single, very siloed goals, and also perhaps in this country, I know it's a global report, but in this country, a sense that nature is the responsibility of DEFRA, when in fact we need to get a lot more systematic sort of link up between departments and between goals. Are there any key messages that or comments you'd like to make on that?
Yeah, well, I think one of the, I mean, some of you may know that I'm seconded into this project from Natural England. So, but what's been fascinating is that this review was actually commissioned by the Treasury, so the Economic and Finance Ministry, not DEFRA. And, you know, I think that's really positive. And there is a small group now within Treasury which are looking at climate and environment things and seeing it as, you know, beginning to see it as part of their portfolio, that actually, you know, what happens with our natural assets and natural capital is directly relevant to all of the things that they are concerned about. So I think I would just agree with that point that, you know, we need it. It's a cross-cutting issue. It shouldn't be siloed. We can see that it impacts on, you know, our personal well-being, our personal wealth, and our economy, and so it absolutely needs to be embedded across all of government departments, in my view. But I do think it is encouraging that this review was commissioned by Treasury, because that's part of that change, institutional change that we're looking for.
Okay, and a question, I suppose, that may be hard to answer at this stage, but maybe is an opportunity to think about aspirations, from Rosie Hales, saying, are there any plans for a team such as the existing one to be working on next steps? And there's so much that could be progressed from this report. It would be really good to think about. That's probably echoed in one from Alessandra Gimona from JHI, talking about the fact that rather meager funds and probably decreasing tend to go to these tasks. How can we grasp the straw and get some more adequate data to help us?
Thank you guys for those questions. I'm free. So you know, ours was a temporary team, so you know, it's a time limited piece of work, but I think, you know, depending on how things go this year with CBD and COP and, you know, G7, there may well be, you know, opportunities for the next phase of this work, but where and who exactly will be doing that, I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure how to answer Alessandro's question. I think it's a really good one. You know, we need more money, yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think that flows from us making the case for why it's relevant and important much more broadly. So that's my hope, that, you know, this review really, it covers so much stuff. It really is broad, and it really does make this theoretical underpinning case for why this is relevant to so many sectors and so many parts of society and the economy. And I think if we get that buy-in, that should then unlock, you know, this support for more work in this area.
Okay, that's great. There's a question here about rewilding and how important, for example, are rewilding projects going to be for building back greater resilience, as well as maintaining adequate food production and so on across the economy. Do you, you know, there is a lot of public discourse, I think, about increasing wild spaces, and, you know, some of that's going to take active intervention. Is that something you've considered or want to comment on?
Yeah, well, I'll comment on the rewilding bit. We looked at rewilding. So the way that the review is written is, you know, as I showed you in that landscape photo, we've got 12 big options for change. So these are quite high level. And that's partly because, you know, it's a global review. We can't be that prescriptive, actually, if we're trying to be meaningful to all sorts of different contexts around the world. So we deliberately kept it, you know, quite high level, but showcased a whole range of successful case studies or techniques that have been used around various different places. So we do look at and, you know, have spent some time looking into rewilding and highlight how useful it is to get this kind of really great kind of kickstart of functioning ecosystems going again. And I mean, I think I'm going to hand over now to Rebecca, because we did also look into this whole idea of whether we should be doing land sparing or effectively keeping places, you know, just for nature, or sharing them where we've got nature embedded in our kind of agricultural or you know, fisheries systems. So we looked at both of those things, but we don't kind of say this is how much you need or this is exactly what you should be doing. Rebecca, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Ruth. Yeah, one of the tensions which the review examined was the tension between this huge increase that we've seen over the last few decades in extractions of provisioning ecosystem services like food and fibre and timber, and how that has come at the expense of the invisible regulating and maintenance services, which actually underpin society and you know, human well-being and livelihoods, but go kind of unnoticed in many cases. So we explored many different possibilities for balancing delivery of different ecosystem services and possibilities for providing provisioning and regulating and maintenance services simultaneously, as well as approaches which kind of leave space explicitly for nature. And it really is context specific, isn't it? There's no kind of one size fits all approach, but if you want to look in more detail in the report, I'd suggest you read the chapter on provisioning and regulating services and the trade-offs between them, which gives some examples of sustainable production systems capable of providing multiple ecosystem services, and also some of the chapters on conservation and restoration, which give examples of how landscapes can be multifunctional and provide benefits for nature and people simultaneously.
Okay, thank you. And there are so many questions coming in. They're sliding up and down my screen very actively. But I'll ask you a more technical one, perhaps, and it might well be that this is more in the Economist thing. But your view on the discussion, I suppose, would be really helpful on why did the review choose inclusive wealth as the sort of measure. And it comes from Jasper Kenter. He's saying, as I understand it, inclusive looks at an add up of some of the different accounting values, assuming natural and human capital are substitutable. Another concept is seeing nature as a fundamental constraint, such as through planetary boundaries framework, and the way that this is used in donut economics and recently by UNDP in the planetary pressures adjusted human development indicator. If the economy is really to be seen as embedded in nature, aren't constraint measures better than substitutability measures? So I'm going to say that I haven't got a clue, and I hope that I've expressed the question well enough that you might give us some comment on the choice.
So yeah, thanks very much. And Jasper, as you know, I'm not an economist, but I'm going to explain, and if it doesn't do the job, come back to me separately. But effectively, within the review, what Partha does is he looks at the wealth well-being equivalent. So he's really interested in inclusive wealth because he thinks it is equivalent to well-being, and ultimately, you know, what he's interested in is improvements or maintenance and improvements in society's well-being. And he makes the argument, the underpinning theoretical argument of why inclusive wealth is a useful measure, because it mirrors this intergenerational welfare and well-being. I think as well that review, it's hard to fit it all in the sort of 25 minutes or whatever, but Partha does also look at the role of what he calls quantity restrictions. So he talks about, you know, accounting prices and markets and all of that stuff that fits into inclusive wealth framework as being, you know, we need to get that right. We need to solve those institutional problems. But he also talks about, you know, quantity restrictions as another part of that tool to enable us to do that. And in some cases, it's much better to say, you know, actually, we're just going to set aside that area, or this place is sacred, so we're not going to, you know, even try and put that into accounting prices or whatever. So, you know, there is also this position of what he calls quantity restrictions within this framework, you know, alongside dealing with accounting prices and improvements in markets and inclusive wealth. Rebecca, I don't know if you wanted to add more to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said there is great, Ruth, and just to emphasize that the review does say that there is a role for quantity restrictions, and it does acknowledge that nature does have sacredness and intrinsic value, and in some cases that it can't be priced, and there's no price which is high enough to reflect, you know, that you can use that some of it is just off limits. And there is a chapter in the review which goes into some of those valuation points in more detail. I think it's chapter 12 for people who are interested in where to look in the full report.
Okay, that's brilliant. And just in terms of that value, another question from Alistair McVitie, is there a problem that nature and natural capital is so far removed in physical and economic terms from many people's decision making? So in other words, the relatively small part of agricultural production in the value of much of the food we consume makes including the value of nature difficult in a way that changes behavior. Certainly that seems to be a Western world problem, and you were looking at this as a global thing. But I just wondered if that sort of decision making and where people see value bit was something that you wanted to comment on.
I can come in on this if you like, Ruth, because I did some of the thinking around behavioural change and what the review says about socially embedded preferences and how we can change consumption patterns potentially without having a significant cost to well-being if societies and large social groups changed behaviour around consumption as a group rather than independently. So that it highlights that there is a really important role for socially embedded preferences because we're social animals and not kind of independent creatures, and that our behaviour and our consumption choices really do depend on the choices of the peer groups that we're in and the peer groups that we aspire to be in. So it does give quite a few examples of how behaviour can be shifted, like taking from many kind of behavioural disciplines, including things like nudge. So there's material on that, which is interesting.
That's brilliant, thank you. And oh, I've just lost it, so I'll have to try and find it as I'm talking. But you discussed tipping points in your presentation, Ruth, and Paul Logan has asked, once we've got a better view on the stocks and the assets and the current changes that are happening, do you think we'll be able to comment on or predict tipping points in the near future? Was this something that we'll be able to foresee, I suppose? And or is this an entirely new work area that we should be thinking of funding now?
Paul, there is some work on trying to get better at predicting where tipping points might be. You know, we kind of reflect a bit on that in the review. I can't remember which chapter that is, Rebecca, is it 5 or something? Anyway, so we do look at that. I think to predict where tipping points are going to be needs, you know, going back to the data point we had earlier, it needs quite close monitoring. Basically, you're looking for systems that are that don't respond as quickly, don't kind of bounce back as quickly from change, which implies that their resilience, you know, is reduced. There's a number of markers and ways that they've used, some of the people have used to try and imply where tipping points might be. But it is really, I think it is still really difficult. And yes, I mean, I'm sure we can do far more work in that area, but I'm not sure we're ever going to get an easy couple of metrics that we can look at, which will be for all the different systems, be able to predict when they might move into a different regime. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Rebecca.
Yeah, I completely echo what you've said there, Ruth. And I think because each ecosystem, that is so unique, there'll be so many different indicators which could potentially imply that a tipping point is close. And I think it is still incredibly difficult to define where tipping points will be reached at the moment, which is a really key reason for the urgency of conservation action, really, and that the review does emphasise that.
Thank you. I'd be very worried if we could see tipping points coming. I'd be afraid people would be waiting for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways what we want to do is avoid them, right? So actually we don't want to get to that point. And, I think it's a way of trying to impress on people the urgency and the risks associated, with moving into that very unpredictable and, the non-linearity of systems means we often can't even if we can manage to predict where we are, we often can't predict what's going to happen afterwards either. So hugely risky. Stay away.
Okay, maybe on a more sort of building up note, there were a couple of questions on urban biodiversity and how can we improve, or there are messages from the review on how urban biodiversity landscapes can be improved, and I suppose in there, given that that's where an awful lot of people live, if the review had given particular consideration to biodiversity loss and human health. You mentioned a couple of things, but there might be some more you wanted to add.
Yeah. So on the urban side, yeah. So we consider all sorts of different urban kind of case studies throughout the review. Sorry, was that Andrew who asked that question? And so
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, we do look at that. We do look at different case studies, Andrew. I mean, we don't give a kind of prescription for exactly what needs to happen in urban areas, but we definitely recognise, this increasing urbanisation that's happening and will continue to happen, and the demands that places on the local environment and a whole range of risks that are increasing for those urban areas, and the need to kind of build nature back in as much as possible. On the health side, there's all sorts of health issues considered throughout the review. So alongside, obviously issues of things like COVID and zoonosis, we look at mental health, we look at nature connectedness, trying to think of them all now, Rebecca, because they're spread throughout the review. So, there are lots of different aspects of the contribution that nature makes to health embedded throughout the different parts of the review. Originally we were going to have a chapter on it, but actually it made more sense to embed it in all of the different aspects. So yeah, we look at physical and mental health and disease, and the risks from environmental degradation on towns and cities.
Okay. I'm flipping about between sort of content and consequences, but I can't ignore the number of questions that there are, I suppose, in here. And I'm just looking at two as I scroll up and down, one from Kerry Tankata and one from Stephanie Ha. I'm just wondering about the response from the Treasury and indeed the Chancellor, who I know we've got yet to hear from, but what in terms of when they're likely to give a response, and whether you think that there are any economic or financial pieces that they will be taking forward.
So I mean, first of all, I don't know what's going to be in the government response. We've got no idea at the moment. I think the response is due in the spring, I think is what they're saying. I think the really great thing about, we launched this on the 2nd of February, and what was absolutely fantastic was we actually got Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, there supporting the review. So he's 100% behind this. And of course, the Chancellor has commissioned the government response. So we've got that support. So we've just got to wait and see what they say. But yes, as I said, it's had a positive response, so we're pleased about that.
Yeah, that's great. And then in terms of other organisations, there's a question in from Steve Martin asking whether in its review of the Countryside Code, Natural England might perhaps embrace some of the Dasgupta review recommendations. Are there other sort of bodies who you think are looking at it? Don't know.
Well, I mean, I've certainly spoken to Natural England's board about the review, and they're very enthusiastic. I mean, a lot of the recommendations, the options for change in the review are kind of core parts of Natural England's remit. So, I hope they will, but I don't know. So, I would expect so.
I think many of the questions are encouraging as opposed to expecting answers, and wanting to talk about all of these potential options, which I think would be so interesting to look at. There's a question from about forests, which I'm going to read out. So it's an inspirational presentation. Thank you. I think that in many third world, this is from Helen James, many in third world countries where there's still considerable poverty, often with poor education levels and problems such as illegal mining, logging of hardwood forests, amongst other environmentally destructive activities, will find it difficult to implement the high-level concepts. How do we deal with these kind of problems? Habitats are being destroyed at alarming rates, and certain governments don't seem to care. As biologists, we all know it's better to protect now than try to reverse damage later. But have you got any thoughts on the way forward for us in these situations?
So I think on the distributional point, I think that's really well made. And the review is not saying that countries with lower income countries shouldn't try to improve the income of their people, or that in some way we should be suppressing them from developing. It absolutely is not saying that. I think in a lot of those countries, what we do find is some of the people with lower incomes actually rely on their natural environment even more. So further degradation there can actually cause even more problems of poverty and so on. So we actually view conservation and restoration as nature as is to help the poor, pro-poor, if you like, to support them going forward. I mean, I think the question about how do we make things better. I mean, this is partly why I joined the team of this review, is in the hope that setting out some of this stuff more sort of clearly and comprehensively will help get this kind of understanding through some of these key decision makers to support the right forms of investment. And I think the financial sector is a really interesting one, actually. And we've had some really great engagement pre and post launch of the review around, various parts of the financial sector being really interested, in trying to pick up the risks and opportunities that nature provides to that sector. And so things like that can really help shift us as biologists. That's not a world we live in. But nevertheless, all of those decisions that those people are making, all of our pension funds or whatever, buying into companies, all of that stuff, if we can influence that system for a positive way, that it sustainably engages with nature, this will all help us, I think, make this shift. It's a big question, that. Read the review.
Yeah, it is a big question, and I also realised that we're in the final minute, and so there are many unanswered questions here, many great questions in the sideline. I think in some of that last question, you probably answered what I was going to be my wrap-up question, which was for the sort of the inheritance track, chair's privilege question of, what did you take from what new things did either of you learn from the review, or new thinking did you take from it, and what new thinking would you like to pass on to somebody else? So if either of you want to dive in on either of those, but I think that you really were emphasizing the fairness point there, Ruth.
So for me, it's about good economics requires good ecology. So Rebecca has to go, so I'm just waving at her.
Right.
Because we have to do another one. But you know, essentially, it really is that what I really like about the review is it has got this really strong grounding on ecology, and it, you know, you can see the flow all the way through from ecosystem functions and processes in their role, and so on and so forth, all the way up through to economy and finance decisions. So yeah, it's a good economy, good economics, and good economy relies on good ecology.
That's a fantastic note to finish on. I'm sorry we can't finish on it live with Rebecca, but I really want to thank you, Ruth, so much for a great presentation. Thank you, Minna, for bringing us all together. Thank you to the audience for a fantastic set of questions, which we're capturing in the side. And really delighted you could join us for the discussion today. An awful lot more to go, I think, and but such a fantastic review. And thanks very much for answering the questions, Ruth. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.